repeat many of the things that you have heard from previous speakers so far, and that is the perspectives of the trade on India's trade policy. And we've heard many comments from speakers so far, and some of those I wanted to share with you. One of our opening speakers said that these are dramatic and disruptive days in India because of the changes in government policy around pulse procurement and pulse importation. The governor from Kenya talked about the massive impact that India's policy has had on her country. There was a plea, I believe, from Argentina, among many, that we need a clear picture, we need predictability. And even a representative from the Indian government acknowledged that we're facing a contradiction. There's, on one hand, trade and relations with buyers and sellers from around the world, and that is really, the contradiction is with what is best for India's farmers and for the domestic support. You know, we had a meeting this morning to have more discussion on this, and we had a very unprecedented participation from representatives from France, Myanmar, Argentina, Russia, Kenya, US and Australia, Mozambique, Turkey, and Tanzania. So many countries have expressed views beyond what I have on the slide. Some representatives expressed disappointment. They noted the real difficulty that they're having. They noted that they're working very hard to find other markets because of the uncertainty in India. A comment was made that we're not contributing to the smoothing of volatility of prices, but rather we are doing things that are maintaining the volatility. A comment was made that with what's going on, it's a signal to farmers in many parts of the world not to grow pulses. And perhaps the most powerful statement was that there's concern that this uncertainty in the policy world around pulses is a threat to global trade in pulses. So clearly, with these range of views, you can see that there is an enormous impact when India makes a change to its domestic policy. So we have many interested parties in this discussion, and first and foremost is a policy to provide support to the farmers of India. And I think all people recognize that this is an important goal, and we are supportive of India's efforts to provide stability to the farmers in India. At the same time, we need to be considering how policy will ultimately impact consumers in India as well. As you know, price volatility in the pulse market is nothing new, and we need to have both the short-term vision of what we can do to help farmers, but we need to make sure that we're not adding to the instability and ultimately doing something that will have a negative impact on the consumers in India. While the primary goal of India's government is not to be concerned about trade relationships, India's primary goal will be to focus on their consumers and their farmers. There are impacts on the global pulse trade, and these are having an enormous impact. We have companies who are in financial difficulty because the rules of the business have changed. India's policy is also affecting farmers around the world. From Canada, you heard a presentation yesterday that farmers may be seeding 15% less. Other market analysts in Canada have predicted 20 to 25 and even 35% reduction in seeded area of lentils and peas. And I know from the discussions with some of the representatives from Africa, from Myanmar, that farmers in those countries as well will be taking a very long look before they will decide to plant pulses, in part because of the low prices, in part because of high carryover stocks, and driven largely by the fact that there is uncertainty as to how India's policy will function in the future. But I think that the trade relationships that are being affected do go beyond agriculture, and so India's considerations of its domestic policy will be looked at from a much broader perspective. In fact, the Prime Minister of India himself has noted that trade and the need to address protectionism is one of his major concerns. When Prime Minister Modi was speaking in Davos, Switzerland at the World Economic Forum, he equated the growing protectionism in global markets with a threat equal or greater than terrorism or climate change. So clearly there are linkages to what some see as protectionist policy for India's agricultural sector and farmers in particular with the domestic policies repercussions to markets around the world. So this is just a statement of what I've heard, the kinds of comments that are being made, but all of us are in a business and we have a responsibility to define a path forward. And so I want to pose some questions to all of you as to whether we as the pulse industry, as one family of pulse industry who support increased production of pulses around the world, including in India, who support increased utilization of pulses, can be a positive role in all of this and play a role in building a strong future for all of us. So the questions that I want to pose to you is whether we can come to a common position around issues of fumigation and the approach that the Indian government could take. Can we come to a common position on quota restrictions and import levies? Are there things that we can do and agree on in terms of treatment of cargoes en route and contracts that are signed between sellers from around the world with Indian buyers? And ultimately, something within our own camp, are there things that we should be looking at in terms of our contracts to ensure that we minimize the number of defaults on contracts and make the trade of pulse even stronger going forward, given all that has changed going on in India? So on one hand, we want to talk about what India's policies are, how it's affecting the world, but ultimately we play a role in developing a stronger future. So let me take these issues one by one, and I'm not here to tell you what the consensus is. I want to share some of my views on this issue and perhaps give you something to talk about. Perhaps you'll be in agreement with my comments, and perhaps you will disagree, but at least we can start a discussion about finding that common ground. On fumigation, it's my view that we cannot allow any government to be using fumigation or plant protection policy as a way to impede trade. Fumigation should be based on sound science-based principles that define the risk that's of concern, where the treatment that's prescribed is commensurate with the risk. I think it's difficult to justify blanket treatments for all countries around the world when all countries face different types of pests and different levels of risk associated with trade. I think it's important that when we have government policy around plant protection, that we are also being very careful with what we're prescribing as treatments. Products like methyl bromide are very damaging to the environment, and I think we have to be very judicious in the use of some of these fumigants to ensure that we continue to have public support and environmental protection in what we're doing. And I think that we do need to have a serious discussion about the use of plant protection policy and financial penalties associated with the inability to use particular products. I think that there are more effective tools than applying financial penalties related to plant protection policy. And so clearly ongoing focus on fumigation is one of the topics that we do need to discuss and come to an agreement on. And let's all remember that India's plant protection policy was introduced in the year 2003. So we're really 15 years into this discussion, and I hope that we can find a long-term and workable solution. More recently, India has introduced quota restrictions first on pulse crops, and now even more recently, the introduction of import levies. I think all speakers have talked about the importance of clear, predictable rules and an understanding of what the economic conditions are for the Indian government to introduce import levies or quotas, what the economic conditions will be when India decides it's going to raise the current levels up to their maximum allowable, and importantly for all the traders in the room, under what conditions and when will these import levies and quota restrictions be removed. This is essential to provide some confidence to the global pulse market, having the global farmers as well as the trade know when and under what conditions India will be back in the market. So basically, in summary, I would say what is going to drive levies up and what will be the cause of having quotas removed or increased on quotas, or having levies reduced for pulse trade. I think that we can look at some best practices as well with the use of things like import levies. For example, I understand that the Indian government, in their levies applied to imported oil, use a published price on which to base the levy as opposed to values on the invoice. There's certainly some advantages to that, and it removes an incentive perhaps to falsify an invoice value to be paying a lower import price or an import levy. So I think it's something that the industry should consider in terms of how we can fine-tune the existing policy to make it work better, and better meaning fair for people all over the world. I think a key thing that we want to achieve, and hopefully we can achieve immediately, is some relief provided to companies who have cargoes en route when levies are increased. There is a precedent under World Trade Organization rules, under Article 5.3, which may not specifically apply to what India's done, but certainly provides the precedent that would say that duties on products that have tariffs shall not be applied to goods en route on the basis of contract settled before the additional duty is imposed. This, I think, would remove a major financial penalty for buyers and sellers who entered into a contract in good faith and weren't aware of government policy shift. So at a minimum, I think that we need to be exempting cargo en route from increases in levies. I think the final part of my presentation is really a question we'll go back to you as traders, and that is how do we bring some stability back into our market and trust into dealing business to business in pulse trade. And these are questions that I will leave to the Global Pulse Confederation to discuss at their meeting in Sri Lanka in May. And I think there's issues such as non-objection certificates that need to be discussed so that we can ensure that we have a proper trade relationship between buyers and sellers in the world. So with that, I'm going to end my presentation just a little bit early because we are running a bit late. But I hope that I've given you some ideas of what we need to think about and what we need to achieve. In summary, we need clear and transparent policy direction from India so that food security and price protection for consumers in India, as well as for businesses around the world, can be achieved. We need to restore some sense of trust that pulse trade will be on solid footing and that companies around the world can be looking to India as a market for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Thank you for saving us those exact 6 minutes. Wonderful, sir. May I please request Mr. Vimal Kothari to please step up on stage, President Memento, very quickly. Always a privilege to have you here, Mr. Brown, and thank you for that wonderful time management, which gives us a bit of time for me to tell you a couple of things. Next on our agenda, farm mechanization and plant protection would have been taken by Shri Ashwini Kumar, who was Joint Secretary, Mechanization, Plant Protection, Ministry of Agriculture and Farmers.